if we want communicative language teaching to work, what's the first step for a teacher in the classroom, and then for the students, and then for the institutions?
Okay, the first step for a teacher is to get rid of what we call the Atlas complex, which is I'm responsible for everything that happens in the classroom, and I'm responsible for my students' success. First thing is stop calling them students, start calling them learners. If you start calling your students learners, and it's like a mantra. They're not students, they're learners. Learners. My learners in my classroom. I have a learner, his name is Bob. I have a learner, his name is Andrew. I have a learner, her name is Jane. Not students. Call them learners. That will start to make you think differently. And then when you realize, then you have to do the second thing, which you realize the learner has a mind that is equipped. It's ready-made to do something with language. I cannot control that. I cannot. That it goes back to the S-Pit quarter, that the learner is on his own timetable or her own timetable. They're going to organize language in a certain way that's beyond my control. I've got to accept that. So that's the second step, understanding that basic thing about language acquisition. And so then the third step would be, okay, once I understand that, my role changes from being a teacher to an active interlocutor with my learners. So I stop teaching and I start interacting.
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Teacher Talking Time podcast. And I wanted to, first of all, thank everyone for listening, and thank you, Bill, for taking the time to come on the show and do this interview. I found an old picture of you, Bill, and I won't share the picture here, but that picture reminded me of how much I wanted to kind of like go back to your humble beginnings. I don't know if you know which picture I'm talking about.
I'm not a mind reader, Leo, so I cannot know what picture you're talking about.
Okay.
Describe it. Go ahead.
I think you were basically in your early 30s, maybe, and you look like the singer from Smash Mouth. Spiky hair, pointing towards
Oh, yeah.
the horizon, and it's
Yeah.
blonde. You're blonde. I think you dyed your hair or something.
Yeah, I used to bleach it for stand-up comedy. And that was in my 40s. That was in my 40s, by the way, not my 30s.
But you look much younger then in that
Yeah.
picture. Yeah. I
Look
thought he
at
was like in your like early 20s, maybe mid 20s, early 30s. That's what I thought.
Yeah, I used to get that a lot. Now I still get that, look at me, I'm 82 right now. No, I'm kidding, I'm not 82. But people think I'm younger than I am, and I'll keep taking it. I'll keep taking it.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So who is BVP, and why does your work matter?
Who is BVP? God, I've never been asked that question. That's like, I feel like I'm in a Barbara Walters special. Who is BVP? Well, let me just say a little bit about my background. I grew up with two languages, Spanish and English. I'm a Mexican, non-Mexican. And so I always was fascinated by languages from an early age because of that. And one thing I noticed in my family growing up was we were like 50 something cousins on my mother's side, traditional Mexican Catholic family. And only a handful of us actually spoke Spanish. The rest didn't. And that classic, I didn't understand that as a kid growing up. Why am I speaking Spanish, but they're not, my cousins aren't. And I did not know all the issues about language retention and attrition and things like that among bilingual and heritage populations. I went to college and I actually did not major in linguistics or anything like that. They didn't have it at my small Jesuit university I went to in California, Santa Clara, go Broncos. And so when I got to graduate school, I actually started Latin American studies, and I didn't like it. It didn't work for me. I wasn't really into economics. So I had a TA-ship in a teaching assistantship in the Spanish department to fund my graduate studies in Latin American studies. And so I switched over there. I said, well, maybe I'll do this and see what happens. Didn't like that. And I was ready to leave Texas and come back to California. I was in Austin at the time. And a professor convinced me to try linguistics. He goes, you got a mind that's more scientific than most people's that I work with. I went, okay, I have no idea what linguistics is. I'll try it. So the next semester I enrolled in 3 linguistics courses. I was hooked. never looked back. So that's why I actually got started in the field. And that's a professional side of me. That along the way, I've done all different kinds of things. I used to act. I used to do stand-up comedy. When I lived in Chicago, I taught at the University of Illinois, Chicago after I left Urbana-Champaign.
Was that while you were teaching, Bill, or?
Yeah, yeah.
Really?
I would do it like sometimes in the evenings once a week and sometimes on the weekends.
Huh.
Do it, you make the circuit, do the dive bars, you're trying to cut your chops with live crowds. Well, let me tell you, it is true what they say. Dying is easy, comedy is hard. That is true.
No kidding.
But yeah.
Did you stand
So,
up only? Did you sketch comedy? Because Second City is Chicago is like the home of sketch, right?
And Second City was down the block from me. I lived on the same street as Second City.
Oh, wow.
And I went to, a number of their shows. But I never did sketch stuff. I never did troupe comedy. I just did my own stuff. And, and I've written off and on. And then about 7 years ago, I decided to start to transition from academia to what I really wanted to do was write full-time, write fiction. And so that's what I'm doing now. So Bill VanPatten is an amalgamation of scholar, academic with a background in linguistics and language acquisition. The funny side likes to stand up in front of an audience and make them laugh, but also likes to write serious fiction on the side. Not so much on the side. I'm doing that most of the time now. So I'm a little bit different from probably most people you've ever talked to.
I would say so. Are there any linguistic jokes, any linguistic bits that you could perhaps share with us?
Oh gosh, no. None of that would make sense. That would make sense to linguists. They wouldn't make any sense here. I have plenty of jokes about people in the profession, but that's another story. You'd have to know who they are too.
Yes, know your audience.
But I suppose you have to have a good knowledge of the language within comedy, right? Like comedy, writing jokes, sitting down to write is language in use, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's rules to comedy. There's tricks to learn and techniques and things. And there's only one thing, if we had time and I had inclination, my voice is killing me because my allergies are acting up from the Central Valley where I live in California. So my chest is hurting and my throat's a little raw. Or I would sing for you the song I wrote for my last show.
Really?
Because I sing during my show too. I'm kind of a full show. And the song is called Processing Blues, because I'm known for my work in second language acquisition for input processing and how people process language. And so I've got this funny little song about that, but it's got that bluesy beat to it,
That's a very interesting. I mean, I was going to ask you something because you were talking about comedy, and this is not a path that I wanted to go down. But since we're here, who's your favorite comedian? Like, who were your perhaps your major influences? I mean, for me, when Andrew said something about like how comedians have a very deep understanding of language, I'm always reminded of George Carlin, which to me is probably one of the best comedians of all times, because I think the way he analyzed language in his stand-up comedy shows was just phenomenal. It was just like something unparalleled.
You're going to be completely surprised by my response. There are two people who I absolutely die to watch on the stage doing comedy. You're not going to believe who they are. Maybe one.
I have no idea.
One is Wanda Sykes.
Oh.
Have you seen any of her specials? I wish I'd have.
I have never seen one of her specials, but she is funny. She is really good.
I watch and I analyze her. First I watch for the fun, then I watch a second or third time and I start to analyze. Oh yeah, I see how she did that, that kind of stuff. And the other person, this is one you're not going to believe, is Bette Midler. People don't think of Bette Midler as a comedian, but if you've never seen a Bette Midler concert, it is half singing, half acting, and stand-up comedy. She does a tremendous amount of stand-up comedy in her concerts. She is funnier than heck. Oh my! And she actually did a comedy album in 1984 called "Mud Will Be Flung Tonight," and I think she got a Grammy nomination for it for best comedy album. She didn't win that year, but she got a nomination for it. And it's just all stand-up comedy. She was at the Improv in LA doing it. So those two, the topics they talk about, the way they do it, they speak to me in some way. I don't know. I love George Carlin too. Don't get me wrong, some of those guys, but
yeah,
I just, for some reason I relate to these two women. They're funnier than
Wanda is
crap.
Yeah, she's phenomenal. Well, you just mentioned it. You have this song, jazz, you said, on input processing. Tell us. I think a lot of people want to understand input processing. What is it? How did you come up? I think I'm more interested because you said you have a scientific mind. How did that scientific mind help you create input processing, this input processing theory?
There's two parts to science when you think about it, if not multiple parts. One's a theoretical side where you sit back and you do like thought experiments, like what Einstein used to do, right?
Mhm.
And you sit and you A and B and C. And so there's a logic to thinking through how things must work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a side, so you create hypotheses, theories and hypotheses. And then there's the empirical side of science, which is you go in and you figure, okay, how can I test this? And so I was actually in graduate school, and I took I took 2 courses on child language acquisition in graduate school,
Mm-hmm.
and had some great professors who really got me to think about some things. And there were some experiments that I was reading. They were doing these children, and I was amazed at how is it? Why can't these children understand these relatively simple sentences? Why can't they? And the sentences were basically simple passives like the cow was kicked by the horse.
Mm.
Right now, those of us who speak English and are fully fluent and knowledgeable know that when you hear the cow was kicked by the horse did the kicking, not the cow, right? So that's the equivalent of the horse kicked the cow, but it's a passive, so we say the cow was kicked by the horse. And little kids up until the age of 5 constantly make mistakes to a very high degree where they think it's the cow kicking the horse.
Mm.
I go, why is that? What are they doing in processing that sentence? It made me think about adults learning languages. And just about then, some of the initial research on second language acquisition was starting to trickle in from Southern California. But nobody was really looking at that kind of processing issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I set up some experiments to do as research for those courses I was taking with second language learners. And I discovered some interesting things. Like they study all this language, these learners, and then you give them a simple sentence to process, and they can't do it. They do it wrong like little kids. And you go, why is that? And so I said, there must be something that filters the language out there that's in the environment that they hear, and the way it gets encoded and then stored somehow, however language is stored in the head, right? There must be something filtering it. They filter something out. And so I had upon this idea that input processing is this little bottleneck somewhere between the language out there you're exposed to and the way your mind actually organizes language, so you create a system in your head. And so it's that little bottleneck part of that piece between the two that I started to focus in on. It all got started because of my work well, I didn't do work in child language acquisition. It's because of the studying of child language acquisition that got me thinking about what adults might be doing learning a second language. So basically, in a nutshell, input processing is about 2 things. How is it that learners in real time, when they're listening, right? You could do it with reading too, but let's focus on listening. In real time, when they're listening and they hear a speech stream, how is it they connect? Under what circumstances and using what strategies do they connect bits and pieces in that speech stream with either meaning or function? How do they do that? Because that's how you got to learn language, right? And the other side of that is, so not just connecting form with meaning or form with function, but also how it is in real time you compute sentence structure. Because you've got to figure out what's the subject, what's the verb, what's the object, what are these other things? How do they all, how these pieces all fit together when you hear a sentence? It sounds probably to the layperson, well, what's so hard about that? Because we do it all the time in our first language. But when you're a second language learner, first beginning to hear language, it ain't that easy. And so there must be strategies or mechanisms you have that direct your unconscious attention to certain things and not others. And that's what I started looking at. And that's the whole part of input processing that really interests me. Did I answer your question? Or are you still,
did.
are you thinking about it?
I'm thinking about the relationship between input processing and an article that you often mention as being probably one of the most important articles in your career, which is an article by Pitt Corder, The Significance of Learners' Errors. I think you were reading this article maybe 10 years later, the article was originally published, and you made I remember you saying this in one of your plenaries. You made a very persuasive case about this, the relationship between, he made a very persuasive relationship between learning and teaching. And there was a statement there that I think you often quote, And I wanted to see if we can kind of like connect the dots here, because he said, we may be able to allow the learner's innate strategies to dictate our practice and determine our syllabus. We may learn to adapt ourselves to his or her needs rather than impose upon him and her our preconceptions of how he or she ought to learn, what he or she ought to learn, and when he or she ought to learn. What's the connection between that quote, input processing, and the way we are teaching languages?
That quote and input processing are not largely collected the way most languages are taught around the world. To cut to the chase, most language teaching, from what I can tell, is not informed by second language acquisition research or even second language acquisition theory. Most language teaching is driven by inertia. That's the way it's been. That's the way we do it. So we're going to keep doing it.
When you say inertia, Bill, you mean like habit inertia? We're just being like
it's
doing the same thing over and over again.
It's the tradition, so why change it? That's inertia.
Right.
You know, it's like Newton's law. You know, something's going to keep moving until it meets a force, an obstacle that stops it. Right. Well, language teaching keep doing what it's doing until it meets a force that stops it. There's been nothing about second language research that really has trickled down to teachers in any significant way, and part of that is due to the way teachers are educated and trained, at least in the United States. This is a little bit true in Canada too.
I think so. I think you make a very good point about that. I think it's not just in Canada, United States, Bill. I think it's all over the world. I worked with teachers in Latin America, in Central America.
Yep.
Even in Europe, I feel the same.
Yeah, I've spoken all around the world, and so I hate to generalize too much because I really don't work in those contexts, but in visiting them and talking to teachers, I get the sense this is pretty ubiquitous, that what we might call traditional language teaching, we have a textbook, you learn things, you practice them, you get tested on them. That's language teaching. And presumably there's some idea about how languages are learned behind that. And so the basic ideas, the basic facts about second language acquisition that we know to be true, regardless of context, regardless of learner, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of motivation, the basic facts about how language gets in your head just don't inform language teaching that much. There are some movements, particularly in the United States, to try to make classrooms more what we call input oriented and acquisition rich and communicative and so on. But those often work in a semi or atheoretical front. They're doing the right things, but they don't always know why they're doing the right things. And what happens, I've been to some of those training sessions, I go, wow, these people are really good, these trainers. But then I watch the teachers who are there learning for the first time how some of this stuff works. And I listen to the questions they ask, and I know exactly what's going to happen. They're going to go back with what they've learned and try to use it as a technique to do what they're already doing, as opposed to completely change their curriculum around and say, I got to get rid of what I'm doing and start from scratch, right? So, and that's often what happens with language teaching. In fact, that book you mentioned before, Making Communicative Language Teaching, that Jim and I wrote, we first wrote, I think, in what year was that? I forget.
I bought a copy of that. I found it in a thrift store. It was, I have to admit, it was cheap.
I'm not going to say
anything. It was a secondhand store. It was a secondhand bookstore. But I have the date here. I'll tell you right now.
God, I hate to be the escort he winds up with, right, Andrew? My God.
That book, Bill, is from...
There's a first and second edition. So you have the blue cover, red cover.
I have the red
like
cover.
a Matrix. There you go.
The red cover. Yeah. Exactly right. He swallowed the red pill. So.
This one is from 1995.
Yeah, 1995. That sounds about right. Okay. Yeah. So we published the first edition. So whenever Jim and I did that first edition, and it also carried it to the second edition, we talk in there about how what often happens with language teaching is the following. There's this ground level of what people do, the tradition of what they do. Then an innovation comes along and people are going, no. And what methodologists who train teachers and what the teachers do is take those ideas and try to layer them onto the existing structure. Right. And that way, I call this pseudo innovation. It's not real innovation, it's pseudo innovation. They might do something a little bit new, but they're still teaching the same old stuff.
I want to go back to something that you said. You said you talk about inertia, and you were talking about how there's a movement in the United States. I think there's a movement all over the world that are. I know there's a cooperative in Spain that is really trying to propagate task-based language teaching. I think we try to do the same thing in Canada. And I know we actually talked to someone who probably knows you. I think her name is Christina, and we were talking to her on LinkedIn the other day. And she was talking about how she's starting a TBLT course with Spanish speakers, young learners, beginners, and all that. We, when we go back to this movement, and you said we're trying to make language teaching and education more input and acquisition rich. What does that mean? I think a lot of people might be asking themselves that question. How can we make the classroom input and acquisition rich?
Well, if you understand how acquisition works, which is in a nutshell, that people acquire language and also the ability to use language by their exposure to language in communicative contexts. So in other words, any person, no matter what their age, gets language in their heads because they hear or see language that's being used to express meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Conversations, film, reading, interactions, whatever you want to call it. So I, as a language, let's say I want to learn Japanese. I can study Japanese all I want. I'm a good linguist. I know how to analyze language. And I can give you personal anecdotes about my French. So when I'm talking about Japanese, I'm thinking about what happened to me in French. I can learn all kinds of things in Japanese, but I know that I'm not going to really acquire any Japanese until I start hearing people talk to me in Japanese. And it's something I can understand. And I start to process those input data, and my brain starts to organize stuff and so on. And then stuff starts to come out eventually in my mouth through interaction with people, which then gets me more of that, what we call input from the environment. And so you got this like a cycle of input. Right. Your output serves not because you need to practice, the output or what you produce in language as part of interaction gets people to talk to you more. Mm-hmm. So you get more input. So input is that idea that there's language out there in the environment that you are listening to or seeing. You could be signing, right? Or seeing that has some kind of meaning that you need to attend to. There's something in that message you want, right? Okay. So that's in a nutshell, that's the most stripped down things. Now, I'm going to step back and say there's a lot going on in your head that we could get into about the way language is organized, what mechanisms exist in your head that impose constraints on language and so on. That happens completely outside of your awareness, and nobody has control over that. It just exists. If you want to talk about that later, ask me about it. So in a nutshell, so you have the input out there in the environment, you have to process it, and then stuff in your head makes use of the data that it gets from the environment. So that's what makes a class, that was what make teaching acquisition rich, and by implication input rich, because your classrooms, if you want them to be acquisition rich, means classroom learners, i.e. students, have to hear and see lots of language being used to communicate something, not to practice, but to communicate.
And I think Andrew's going to kind of like connect this to an interview that we did with Paul Nation a couple of months ago, where he was talking about a school in Japan. Do you remember that, Andrew?
Yeah, of course. Oh my gosh, I would love
classes.
this example. Yeah, the school in Japan, I forget the name. He mentioned it, but where it's just the reading, right? So it's just they have classes and the students get to choose. There's, I guess, 2 hours, and they can choose 2 hours of reading with just free reading. You bring a book, you open it, you read 2 hours, class is over, you go home. Or you can have one hour of that and 1 hour of, what you call traditional class instruction activities, talking about it, whatever. And I love that because Paul Nation's contention that I think we align with is we need more of just being in the language, and there's not a test at the end. There's not a drill exercise. There's not a grammatical gap fill. It's just, and Paul's big niche is vocabulary and reading, and just people need to read in the language for no other reason than it's fun, and that it leads to acquiring that language. And that class, that Japanese school, was a really good example of that.
Yeah, I'm absolutely in alignment with Paul Nation. Paul works in vocabulary development and lexical development. I work in syntax and morphology. There are other people who work in phonology and pronunciation and the sound system thing. Other people work in different parts of language. But all of us concur that whatever aspect of language you're looking at, and the way you build language in your head comes from what you're exposed to in communicative environments. And reading, people often think, well, reading's not communicative. Damn right it is.
It really is, yeah.
I'm a writer. I write because I want you to read something. I got a story I want you to read. And you read my novel, you read my short story because it's interesting, and you process every sentence because, oh my God, where's this going? The tension. And this guy just said that. Oh my God, what's going to happen to him?
You do a really good job of that.
That's communication right there. The expression and interpretation of meaning in a given context for a given purpose. That's communication. It doesn't have to be one-on-one talk. It doesn't have to be like what we're doing right now. Reading is a communicative act. Writing is a communicative act, and so on. Anyway, so Paul is right. And the research on vocabulary acquisition is pretty clear that there's no way that you can get to any advanced level of language, and certainly not in your first language, unless you read and read a lot.
Yeah.
Paul Nation's comment, we were talking about vocabulary and reading. I just wrote a chapter. I'm doing a second edition of my book with the American Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages, ACTFL. Second
Which
edition
book?
of it's while we're on the topic.
Oh yeah.
And I've added a new chapter.
Copy here.
Yeah, I'm adding a 7th principle about reading should be integral to the classroom. And so one of the things I talk about in there that we don't often hear about in reading is that, you learn a lot of vocabulary and you can learn grammar, so on. But reading provides the foundation for writing. And writing is more than just putting sentences together and having good grammar and blah, 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 or learning words. It's also about style. It's about discourse. A story moves, how a paragraph flows. And you don't realize this when you read and read and read, especially in particular genres, you start to unconsciously pick up how those things work. What's the beginning of a paragraph looks like? How is it? When is a paragraph finished? When do I move on to a new paragraph? Or what's the tone? What's the style? All those things you pick up through reading. And you can hone those things afterwards through some explicit work, but you don't get it through explicit learning. You get that from picking up through reading. So reading is very powerful for all kinds of things that we do in communication.
It's funny you say that, because what I'm hearing is most learning occurs incidentally as opposed to intentionally, which is normally what we're trying to do. We're trying to control the variables of learning in the classroom by telling students, this is exactly the grammar point that you're going to learn today. These are exactly the same, the 10 pieces of lexes that you're going to learn today. But none of that actually might stick for a long period of time. Might stick for maybe 10, 15 minutes. But then when you get to the end of the PPP, you're just basically praying that the students are actually using the language that you have taught. Which brings me to a very important question now, Bill. Oh, you're there. What happened to your French?
What happened to my French? I don't know why it's saying my internet connection is unstable. I'm right here plugged into the wall. No, what happened to my French is I actually have an MA, which is almost half in French. I took a little bit of French in high school, like a year in high school. And I didn't really take any in college. And then when I got to graduate school, and I told you the story how I switched to linguistics, the MA program I wound up in was in Romance linguistics. They didn't have a pure Spanish linguistics, and I wasn't in the linguistics department, I was actually in the Spanish department. So I had to take courses in French linguistics. Well, I had to take some French first so I could make sure I could take those courses. And I went ahead and enrolled in a second year intensive course and so on. And it was that traditional stuff. And ironies, the guy who taught the course was a teaching assistant getting a PhD in foreign language education. But it was one of the most traditional classes I've ever taken. And I had an office mate at the time who was a French speaker. Her mother was French, her father was not, but she learned French from her mother in the home. And so she was a fluent speaker of French. So I said, speak to me in French. And she did. And sometimes I make her slow down and so on. And she said, you ought to join. There's a French group that meets over at the cafe, whatever it used to be called by the university. Sure, I'd go and they'd be speaking French. It was way too fast for me. I'd ask them to slow down. I'd get what I could and so on. I started watching French movies and reading. I read Camus, I read his L'Étranger, stuff like that, to start doing things. And I realized that There was no way that I was going to learn any French in classrooms. I had to do it this way. And I'm a linguist. I can analyze language. Nobody, I know exactly what the properties of a subject are, what the properties of a verb are, and how to describe them abstractly and all that kind of stuff. But I knew I was a witness of my own inability to take that classroom learning and make it do something. I had to get input and interaction with that input. And then I kept working on, just watching, do stuff on my own. Got through that MA program, finished my degree, kept up a little bit French on the side here and there. And then I got a opportunity to teach in Laval one summer in Quebec. Yeah.
Quebec,
And so there were certain people I met there who were really good about speaking with non-native speakers. And I gravitated toward them. And I learned so much French from interacting with them. And those are like, oh God, yeah, I'll come to dinner with you. Yeah, please, let's go. There were other people who spoke really fast and weren't very, what do you call it, sympathetic, or they just didn't understand what second language learners needed. And so I tended to shy away from them. So I gravitated. It's just like read what you want to read, right? So I gravitated to the speakers that made sense to me. And that summer I taught in Laval, I felt like my French went up another notch from just interacting with people. I can't say I'm a great French speaker right now. I'm not, but
But it's there.
It's there.
It's there.
It's there. Yeah, it's there. And I, if I want to, I could go live in France for a year, and I'll be like, what's his name? Bradley Cooper getting out, at the end. But
you'll probably be singing at the Moulin Rouge or something,
the moula.
So it's a lot of exposure then. A lot of everything what you said is exposure in these communicative environments with a focus on communicating a very specific message. So you were motivated to learn, you were exposed to the language, you were using the language, and you received pretty good input, I guess. So you were just, which leads to a very important question, because you wrote a paper in, I think it was 2021. And I'm going to actually just ask you the question. Was Krashen right?
Oh, could I take it? This is water, by the way. I need a sip of my water. Hold on a second.
Okay. That's good timing.
As I told you, my throat is dry and my chest is hurting from this stupid allergy season we got going on here and all the rain that's coming down. It's probably mold. Yes, Steve was right. I consider, first of all, Steve is a friend of mine. Are we close friends? Do we live next door to each other? No, but we're friends. In fact, I just got an email from him yesterday about something. And he and I did keynotes together at a conference about comprehensible input. And we were also co-featured speakers at an ACTFL meeting one year. We packed the room, like 500 people came into this room. They had to call the fire marshal because they thought, people were not trampling each other getting out of there. But so Steve and I have corresponded over the years, and I met him when I got my first job. He came to Michigan State. He was a keynote speaker along with somebody else. And it was not a conference I would normally attend. It was about African language teaching, or teaching of African languages, I should say. But I got the organizer to say, yeah, I want to go to lunch with you guys. And so sat next to Steve, and he started giving me some mentoring advice because I was brand new in my career. I was like bummed, like, why don't people want to publish my stuff? What's going on? He would say, Bill, you just, don't give up. Here's what you do. And he just gave me for like a year. I kept in touch with him. He just gave me some good fatherly, solid mentoring advice. And then my career took off after that. And we've always agreed like 99.9% of the time, not 100% of the time. And so when Karen Lichtman and I wrote that article, Was Krashen Right? What we wanted to do was go back, wind up, let me backtrack. In the 80s, 1980s, Krashen launched his original hypothesis in the late 70s. He wrote his first book in the early 80s, like 82. Then he started working on some other things. So by the early to mid 80s, his ideas were out there and were big. The backlash in the language teaching community and in some of the L2 scholarship community was pretty nasty. They did not want to hear about this. In fact, I was told, because I was doing second language research in Spanish classrooms in the US, well, you can't do that. We're foreign language learners. We're not second language learners. And I would argue, no, it's all the same. The context is no difference. A learner is a learner is a learner.
Yeah.
Oh no, and I got blacklisted for a while from
Really?
national organizations. Oh yeah,
Wow.
and there was a big movement called Krashen bashing,
Really?
which
Crash
yeah,
and Bastion.
I hear you're gonna love this. Fast forward, and we'll come back and go. I'll rewind. Fast forward to the late '90s, early 2000s, and there were people who started doing VanPatten bashing. That was a thing. I heard
No
about
That's how
it.
you know
way.
you made it.
That
That's
was
how
a
you know
thing.
you made it.
I heard about. Yes, there were groups of people getting together to bash me. Anyway, and they tried to do it in print, and I took care of that. And look, now it's all gone.
Did Steve
Anyway,
call you and say you did it?
no, no. Well, Steve didn't hear about it. I heard about it anyway. So I've been in the profession long enough to watch how some ideas take root and they go underground. And what people do is they rediscover them and they give them a new name, or they tackle a topic but they don't want to take it back to its source. And a lot of the times it happens in the field of L2 research. You've got younger scholars who don't know the original research. It's just absolutely, to me, embarrassing. They don't know the basic foundational research from the 70s and 80s that got the field started. That research has not gone away and been disproven. They just don't know it because their graduate programs aren't making them exposed to it. There's too much of a push now that you got to be in the 2020s. And well, I'm sorry, but where would physics be right now without Albert Einstein from 1912, right? Okay, so I approached Karen and said, we need to do something because Krashen's ideas are foundational for contemporary L2 research and teaching, but nobody really gives the guy credit and understands, what's really happened, what hasn't been disproved. Because we would hear things like, "Oh, Krashen, that's old theory. We have it. Nobody, that's been disproven."
That's
No, it
usually
hasn't.
the how they dismiss it. They say it's old theory, it's from the 80s,
Yeah,
whatever.
it has been disproven. Exactly. So what we said is no. And so we wrote an article to show how it wasn't, and how a lot of the ideas were just transformed with different terminology, and people don't even know, they don't even trace it back to Krashen's original ideas. So he was right.
So what are some of those ideas then? Because
Well,
I remember one of the most problematic, actually, I found it here. I want to mention this to you. There's an article saying here, crash and bashing was apparently in vogue in the 80s. You were right. I didn't know that.
Yep. So one of the foundational ideas is the role of comprehensible communicatively embedded comprehensible input. That's his input hypothesis is foundational. You get language in your head and you learn languages or acquire languages through your exposure to input embedded in communicative context. Okay, foundational. That is now mainstream in almost every single theory in L2 in second language research. Not all, but most theories. There are a couple of theories that I consider wacko, but I won't mention who they are. But even theories that, let's take, for example, like a generative theory like I come from and a psycholinguistic theory like I come from, as opposed to the usage-based theories that don't believe in a Chomskyan module in the head for language. Okay, so you don't believe in UG, I believe in UG, universal grammar. But both theories go, you cannot get language in your head, whatever you want to call it. You cannot get in your head without exposure to input and lots of it. End of story. So even theories that look to be in competition have some basic fundamental things. That's one. Another thing that he commented on was that the difference between acquisition and learning.
Right.
Okay, so learning is your explicit learning, like you said earlier, Leo, you learn the 10 Lexis items for the day, and here's my grammar rule, PPP, let's teach it and practice it and blah, blah, blah. He said that results in one kind of knowledge, but that's not the knowledge you need for language.
Right.
There's acquisition, which is through processing input and stuff happens in your head over time. That has morphed into what we now call explicit implicit learning. And here's what's interesting. We spent decades where people were trying to make a case for explicit learning and explicit learning, ignoring the acquisition learning distinction. And if push comes to shove, because the explicit learning distinction comes from psychology, not from linguistics. If push comes to shove, 95% of the people working in the field would say, yeah, language learning is almost all implicit. Explicit plays only a minor role, if any role at all. That means Krashen was right about acquisition is more fundamental than learning. Okay, so that's another example. And he talked a little bit about the affective filter, about language not getting in your head and so on. And he was basically right. There's been a lot of research done on motivation and attitude and things like that. It's been researched the wrong way, but when you sit back and look at the research in its entirety, you realize, yeah, he is right. There's stuff that keeps people, it just blocks them, because this happened to me in French. I remember the first time I was with some native speakers, I was telling you the stories earlier, I was scared, Liz. I couldn't, they were speaking stuff, oh my God. And I kind of like froze and shut off. I stopped paying attention, right? My affective filter went up. So those things he talked about, those are 3 examples. He basically had 5 components of his theory, his model. And those have endured. Well, Karen and I talk about in that article, so I'm glad you mentioned. I hope your listeners actually read that. It was published in 2021 in Foreign Language Annals.
We're going to link it to the show notes, because I remember when I read that was the paper. I was like, okay, I need to get Bill on the podcast. It took me 3 years to get you on the podcast, but here we are.
I'm in such demand.
I know.
Well, now that I'm done with my show in Las Vegas, I have a little more free time.
Right. And
Celine Dion can't do it anymore, so I had to step in. So.
There you go.
I mean, someone has to do it.
What is the pushback? Or 1979 did Krashen come out with that? Something like this a few years ago. Why do you think it's still such an issue that people are talking about? Why haven't we accepted it?
I'll tell you why. I think in the research circles, they have accepted it. They just don't credit Krashen, except in passing. So this is a lot of what Krashen said in the late 70s, early 80s is now part of mainstream theory. Like I said, it went underground, surfaced with different jargon and so on. So it's there. It is absolutely foundational. And in fact, can I just put a plug in right now before I finish answering your question, Andrew? Yeah. If your readers out there want to know anything about the field, there's 3 things to read that are foundational in my mind. You read S. Pitt Corder's The Significance of Learners' Errors. You read Larry Selinker's Inner Language paper from 1972. And you read Krashen's book from 1982. He wrote before that, but he put all the ideas together in his book in 1982. I think it was called Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition, or of Second Language Acquisition. So those are foundational. Read those things. Everything we do is traced back to those in some way or another.
You're right. That's the name, 1982.
Yeah. Okay. And so the pushback comes from the following. What I said earlier was that so scholars are largely accepting of the basic ideas. But language education, the teaching of languages, is not. Largely because they're so preoccupied with getting people to speak. You got to speak right away. The only way to get people to speak right away is if you teach them a rule, make them practice it, and they do this fake ability, which, as Leo said earlier, kind of disappears relatively quickly. It does, but it makes it look like something is happening, right? Because there's this emphasis on speaking, and rather than letting speaking emerge and evolve over time. And so I think the pushback comes largely from language teaching circles and also the textbook industry, which is the textbook industry is so geared toward what sells. If you can't get teachers to buy something different, why would textbook publishers publish something different? I actually wrote an article about this back in the 80s called, it was The Vicious Cycle of Language Teaching and Publishing.
Is that what
teachers? Go ahead.
Sorry, no. You mentioned earlier about doing sessions and teachers kind of layering on top of new concepts. Is that a product of what you're describing here, where it's because of I don't know if you would say because of textbooks or because of how the classroom usually works? It's just, whatever adjective you want to use, overwhelming. I don't know if it's impossible to implement a approach like what Krashen and others would advocate for.
No, it's not impossible. In fact, we just had a session yesterday with several independent school districts in Northern Texas. Great session, by the way. Shout out to those people. The problem largely has to do, Andrew and Leo, with institutionalized education. Teachers need time to innovate. but they're not given the time to innovate. So that's one problem. If you don't have time to develop a whole new curriculum, you just go with the curriculum that's there. And what's your curriculum based on? A textbook.
Or just grammar.
Yep. Which
a
is
very what do you call a synthetic syllabus, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll tell you an anecdote about one of the last classes I taught at Michigan State before I left there and came back to California. So ask me about that because it's related. But so what Andrew's asking about is it's that idea that institutionalized education puts severe pressure on teachers to perform in certain ways and then doesn't give them the time to do it. The second part is the way teachers are evaluated. That's another thing.
Yeah.
And what principals or supervisors think they should be seeing in the classroom because they've taken some course in education about this and that. Yeah. The third thing that's related to that is in schools of education and high schools and elementary schools buy into this is that Spanish, French, Japanese, Russian, Arabic is just another subject.
Yeah.
Like history, math, science. So whatever principles there are of education apply to Spanish, Russian, Arabic, Japanese, and so on. When my argument, I keep telling people, I've been saying this for 20 years, make the argument that languages are different. They're not a subject matter, they're something else. If your goal is to acquisition and communicative ability. And then the fifth part of that institutionalized education that's a problem is grades. Everybody's worried about grades. And so we talked at length about this yesterday in the workshop, not at length, but for some period of time at the end. And I was giving them strategies on how to get around that and what you can start to do. And I had a suggestion for people. I'll throw this out if anybody out there listening is wondering about this concept, is it seems so overwhelming to make change like this, to go from your textbook bound, grammar bound classroom to something that's fully communicative. Well, don't try to do it all at once. I'm a big believer in 5-year plans. Like live with someone for 5 years before you want to marry them. Okay. Do your finances. What do I want to be in 5 years with my finances? That, 5-year plans are great. And then you work backwards from 5-year plans. So in curriculum development and teachers, I tell them, where do you want your curriculum to be in 5 years? Work backwards and then say, what can I do year 1? Then what change can I make year 2? What year can I make 3? Until you get to your goal. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to do it all at once. And that way, the little time you have to work on curriculum on your own is much more doable.
Oh man, there's so many things I want to talk about here. You've opened up a bunch of different doors here. But one of the things you were saying is how institutions put a lot of pressure on teachers. And I think what happens in the classroom is that teachers are pressuring students to speak, to communicate, as you said, this pseudo communication, because, and I remember reading in one of your books, don't remember which one now, but you said that communicative language teaching involves letting go of certain roles that both teachers and students bring to the classroom. As part of this, I think you used the word implicit, and I love that term, implicit socialization in the educational process. Teachers often assume too much responsibility in language teaching, and students often assume too little. And you advocate for change in this pattern if we want communicative language teaching to work. What's the first step for a teacher in the classroom, and then for the students, and then for the institutions?
Okay, the first step for a teacher is to get rid of what we call the Atlas complex, which is I'm responsible for everything that happens in the classroom, and I'm responsible for my students' success. First thing is stop calling them students, start calling them learners. If you start calling your students learners and do that, it's like a mantra. They're not students, they're learners. Learners. My learners in my classroom. I have a learner, his name is Bob. I have a learner, his name is Andrew. I have a learner, her name is Jane. Not students. Call them learners. That will start to make you think differently. And then when you realize, then you have to do the second thing, which you realize the learner has a mind that is equipped, it's ready-made to do something with language. I cannot control that. I cannot. That it goes back to the S-Pit quarter, that the learner is on his own timetable or her own timetable. They're going to organize language in a certain way that's beyond my control. I've got to accept that. So that's the second step, understanding that basic thing about language acquisition. And so then the third step would be, okay, once I understand that, my role changes from being a teacher to an active interlocutor with my learners. So I stop teaching and I start interacting. So the first step, I forgot what the first step was already. The
first step was
the Atlas complex. Get rid of the Atlas complex.
Getting rid of the Atlas complex and thinking you're responsible for everything.
Calling them learners.
And yeah, calling them learners instead of students. Understanding, the third thing is understanding that their heads and their minds are going to do something that you have absolutely no control over. Absolutely none. And the fourth thing is, once you realize those three things, drop the name teacher, because you no longer teach. You're an interlocutor. You're there to provide interaction.
A lot of this connects to the concept. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Bill, but Scott Thornbury, who was also on the podcast a while ago, has coined a term called dogme ELT, or teaching unplugged, which he basically calls a pedagogy of bare essentials, where the teacher is not a teacher. He is just, as you said, an interlocutor. He is just an active participant in the classroom discourse. And I can't help but see a lot of the associations, and I can kind of see how a lot of what Scott was doing was also drinking from the same fountains as Krashen, and probably your work as well. And why is it so hard, though? Why is it? Because I'm going to go back to something that you said at the beginning of the show. It's really hard for teachers because they know certain things, but that knowledge doesn't translate into belief, right? So a lot of what teachers are doing in the classroom is it's based on what they know, but it's also based on what they believe. And as you said, a lot of them are thinking of strategies. What kinds of techniques can I use within the textbook that I currently use? So is the answer then to real innovation, as you distinguish between real innovation and pseudo innovation in your talk? So is real innovation then getting rid of the textbook?
And ultimately, yeah. And this, okay. Now I can tell you my anecdote about one of the last courses I did at Michigan.
Oh yeah, Michigan to California.
Before I moved back to California, because as you all know, I'm a native Californian, and I was admonished by a certain faculty member, que en paz descanse, as we say in Spanish, may she rest in peace. She died a few years back, but she and I had tremendous mutual respect, but she didn't like me because I had some radical ideas about stuff, according to her. She was a big traditionalist and not in my field at all. And so I always had very, very high student evaluations. I have to call them student evaluation, not learner evaluations, but I had evaluations for my classes. And she remarked at a faculty meeting in front of me, well, you just have those kind of evaluations because you teach largely graduate courses. If you taught more undergraduate courses, your evaluations would go down because they're too hard to teach. These undergraduates don't want to learn anything. I go, really? I go, what's the worst course that you all just can't? They go, we hate that conversation course. I'll teach it. So here's the part. Here's what you're going to like is, so they signed me up to teach the conversation course. And so they were curious. They said, are you going to use the book? I forget what it was called. I won't even say the name. I go, no, why would I use the book? Well, what book are you going to use? I'm not going to use any book. So what's your course going to be based on? I go, I don't know. I'll figure it out. I was very flippant. I already in my mind knew what I was going to do. But I said, I'll figure it out. But I'm not going to use a book. And so I did. I put a whole new course together. And there was somebody else who was assigned. He was a lecturer at the time. And he goes, oh, I don't know what to do with this course. And his background was in literary studies, not in linguistics or language acquisition or anything. And he goes, can I piggyback on what you're doing? It sounds like it's really interesting. I go, sure. And in fact, we're still friends. He just called me the other day to check on me because of the rain. He wanted to make sure I wasn't flooded out. He learned so much about getting rid of a textbook and doing a course from scratch that made sense. So what we did is we took that conversation course, and instead of being a course where you did these speaking practices from a textbook, it became a conversation course, and there was no textbook. And you'd be surprised about what I used as, because it was a third year of Spanish course, what I used as some impetus for content.
Okay.
You know the movie Pan's Labyrinth?
Yeah. Yeah.
From
What's his name? Guillermo del Toro. Yeah.
Guillermo del Toro. And so I broke it up into 7 segments because it's a 14-week course. So we do one segment, every 2 weeks. So I was able to break it up in like 5 and 7-minute segments. So imagine like if you saw it on TV, they put commercials in. And so what we did is we basically used that just to pull a theme out of it. So I wasn't expecting them, although they were fascinated by the movie. None of them had ever seen it. They were fascinated by the movie. I'd pull a theme out of it. So like the first, the first segment, you see very, very right away that the mother and daughter have a very close relationship. There's no father, and she's going to marry this captain guy who's going to be the little girl's stepfather. So I asked the class after we watched it, I said, I already had that set up, what we're going to do. I said, so give me an adjective. And they didn't have a lot of words in Spanish, so they would give me the words in English, and I put it up on the board, and that became something that we started using in class. So I said, one word, what's the relationship between the mother and daughter? And they all almost in unison said, tight knit or close. One of those two things. I go, good. So I put the word on the board, estrecha, una relación estrecha, on the board. And, oh yeah. So I said, okay, I started asking them, who has a tight or close, una relación estrecha con la mamá? And then people raised their hands and then I go, and there was this one kid sitting in the front. I go, yeah. I go, give me an example of how you have a close relationship. And he says, I write to my mother every night an email. And the whole class perked up. I go, you write to your mother every night? He goes, yeah. And he says in Spanish, yo soy un mami's boy. And so I went, okay. And so the next thing you know, guess what happened? We started doing a semantic map on the board. What are the attributes of a mommy's boy?
Right.
And then we switched. We got down. I go, is there such a thing as a daddy's girl? And so a woman raised her hand. She goes, I'm a daddy's girl. I go, oh yeah, give us an example. And then we did the same thing. And then we compared and contrasted a daddy's girl with him. See how I let the class drive the content? I pulled the theme out from what we watched and used that, and then found out who these learners were and what they were about. Long story short, and we also had, even though it was a conversation course, we had writing activities that were really fun things that I taught them how to actually write, not do sentences and write essays, but actually write like you're going to be a writer. And so 2 things happened at the end of the course is I got a perfect evaluation from the entire class. Every single person filled out the evaluation form, which is odd. They usually don't. And they gave me and the class, because there's 2 different categories, the professor and the class, perfect scores across the board. And they gave a lot of them really great comments. And one of the things they said was, even though this was a conversation class, I learned more about writing than I did in my composition course. Right. So then the faculty started going, what the hell did you do in this class? I told them. So, but anyway, that's an example of how people freak out. I mean, my colleagues freaked out when, not all of them, it was like 3 or 4 of them freaked out, like, well, you're not going to use a book. What are you going to do?
Yeah. What happened after that? After you shared that happened, and then what was the extension of that? Did that happen again, or was that a one-off for you?
Well, that was the last course I actually taught. And then the guy who was co-taught with me, he took it and it expanded a little bit more. He kept working with it. I think he still uses that framework, that kind of thing. He realized that, textbooks aren't always the way to go. So and he like,
sorry,
go ahead. I'm sorry. No, that's all.
No, I have a quote from you here on this topic, talking about language and identifying words that are either comedic or not, or just that pop out to me. And cahoots is one of these words. And you said that textbook publishers are in cahoots with institutionalized education to produce packages that fit into the need to test.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a really captivating quote. Is the story you just told, it's a one-off story, but is that kind of what you're representing there with that quote?
Yeah, exactly. Because whether you're a high school teacher, elementary school teacher, or a college, university teacher, the name of the game is testing.
Yeah.
And give a grade, A, B, C, D, or 4.0 or 3.2, that kind of thing. And so that textbook publishers, I will say this, they would do something different if it was demanded of them, if there was a market for it. But there's not enough market from 9 through 12 teachers or university teachers to do something different. There's not enough of people like me who go, I'm going to use a book, because, you know, sure, they lost out at Michigan State, but there's, 50 other institutions buying that quote unquote conversation book they publish, right? So they'll go find somebody else to do that adoption, or they'll come back after I leave and see if they can get it readopted, right, or whatever. But I don't blame textbook publishers. They're just responding to the market.
Exactly.
So if the market doesn't change, then textbooks won't change.
And
How did you in that, sorry, how did you in that class assess the class? 'Cause I know people listening will be on board with, oh, that sounds great, I want to try it, perhaps.
Yeah.
But then eventually we need to, there needs to be something submitted to the institution, right? How did you go about assessing in that environment?
Well, it was a conversation class. So I did one, I divided the grade up into different sections, different components, right? And we had, first was attendance, because you had to be, it's a conversation class. They had homework. I'll tell you about the kind of homework they had in a minute. So they had to be there. So I forget how much of the grade was you had to be there. And because I made it significant, I think I had almost perfect attendance. I had one woman who, her grandmother died, and she wrote me at midnight for a class. When I woke up in the morning, there was the email waiting for me. I just heard my grandma died. I'm going to miss class. I don't want to miss your class. I got to go. Don't worry about it. Okay, we'll fix you up. We'll fix you up. So what we did is I taped the class for her, so she had access to the class and blah, blah. But and then there was one guy who had a professional job interview or something, and otherwise everybody was there all the time. Okay, so I know they're there and they're going to be learning something because they're there. And if you structure the class such that there's no textbook and stuff, if you're not paying attention, you can't do what you need to do, right? So homework involved two kinds. There was prep before you came to class that was online. And sometimes it was related to the movie, like the segment. I'd give them like some snippets of the movie to preview and then answer some questions about, just to get them ready to watch the movie. And then we'd watch it in class. They didn't have access to the whole movie. Just give them snippets so they could. And then we'd watch the whole segment in class so we could experience it like you're in a theater or group watching. And so that kind of homework. And they also had follow-up homework involved doing something with the information we had. So like, take that example of the mommy's boy, the daddy's girl, and that happened. On the spot, I gave them the homework. Hey, you have to go home tonight. I want 50 words out of all of you in Spanish about why I am or why I'm not a mommy's boy or daddy's girl.
Right.
And
Nice.
so that's your homework. Bring it tomorrow. And so they did, and I would look them over, and because it would actually make them send them to me first. I should take that back. I sent it back to them, said, this looks really good. Okay, we're going to share these with the class. And then we'd go over it and we'd talk about what was in the content before we went on to the next topic and so on. So they had that kind of homework where it was always a follow-up to what happened. And sometimes, like, I could just as easy in that class said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I didn't do it, but here's what I want you to do. With the stuff that's on the board right now, with someone next to you, I want you to write 5 to 10 interview questions about how to find out if somebody's a mommy's boy or daddy's girl. Then what I want you to do is you have to go interview 10 people, your dorm, your apartment area, where you were, I don't care. Interview 10 people and find out if they're mommy's girl or daddy's boy and what their answers are. And then you have to come back and tell us in Spanish what they said. And I did those kinds of, survey kinds of things, go out and get information and bring it back in other kinds of classes. So, but I didn't do it in that particular, my memory says I did not do that because I would have remembered doing it. But anyway, so you get graded for doing those kinds of stuff. And usually I gave a 0, 1, 2 kind of grade, like 0 means you didn't do it. 2 meant you did it. It was, you really did a great job. And 1 meant you were somewhere between, you did it, but I kind of felt like you weren't, I would just tell, just a holistic grade. I just go, this looks half-hearted. I'm sorry. And sure enough, after a couple of those 0, 1s, 2s, people started getting more 2s. And then there was a group work they had to do in class, and I would run around and listen to them. And then they had to fill out these sheets like once a week about their own participation in class. That was part of the grade. So I assess them about performance, about being there, And I don't mean performance in the sense of qualitative ABC, like I said, 0, 1, 2, which would incentivize them to be, And then here's the other thing I did too, which was really useful if anybody ever wants to try this. I started doing group writing about 23 years ago when I was
Group writing.
when I was in Chicago. I was at University of Illinois, Chicago. It occurred to me, because I'm a linguist, half the stuff I write alone, half the stuff I write with somebody else, or it's 3 authors or 4 authors on something. And I go, who the hell decided that everything somebody does has to be a single author? Why can't my students, in the real world, you get feedback from people. In the real world, you share something. In the real world, you write together, right?
You write a comment on YouTube and people reply.
Yeah, that, or, look at all the King's Men. That was Woodward and Bernstein, for example. I mean, there's that kind of thing. So I said, I bet my students could learn a lot by learning to write with each other. So I started forming groups of 4. And I devised this plan by which they'd be like, the writing workshop would happen over 2 days in class. I'd give them to talk what they had to do. One person would be the secretary, would have to sit there and type it into the computer, while the others, they brainstorm. And that secretary role would change each time they had an assignment, right? So it wasn't always the same person. And they'd get feedback from me, and they had to send it to also one other group minimally to get feedback. Then take it back, and then the next day of the writing, they'd be doing some more. And what I discovered was because what I told them is, you're writing one essay for all 4 of you. You're not turning a single essay for yourself. So you're going to turn in an essay, and Andrew's name is going to be on it, Leo's name is, Bill's name is going to be on it, and Angelica's name is going to be on it. Sink or swim. Boy, did the quality of writing improve. Boy, did it take seriously. This is no longer an exercise, it's just to write. And they'd ask me, they'd call me over because of the first episode of what would happen in writing. They'd call me over, do you like this first sentence? Does it get your attention? No, it doesn't. Sorry. And I'd walk away. And they'd go, oh my God, we got to write. And I would do things like that to them. And then sometimes they'd call me over and they go, okay, we got this much. What do you think? I go, oh, that's pretty good. I go, but that's kind of a weak word. Put a stronger word in there. And I'd walk away. Stuff like that. And they really took it seriously. And so those assignments also got a grade too. That was a 0, 1, 2 that they'd get for their writing. So at the end, they got a grade, and they all did very well because they were so motivated, and they just really liked the class. They just wanted to be there and do the work. So anyway.
And I think that happens, Bill. And I think this is a great story to illustrate everything that we believe in. And it's good to hear that from a well-renowned linguist, someone who's been in this field for such a long time. And what I'm hearing here is like a lot of language teaching has to be relevant. I think when you gave the example of the movie Pam's Labyrinth, like the materials, the text, the audios, the videos, all of that should have some sort of relevance for the learners. What I'm also hearing there is that the learner's voice is giving recognition. You are interacting with the learners. You're not interacting with them as a teacher. What you're doing there is you're engaging with them.
Right.
And I think I think Scott wrote about that, the most direct route to learning is to be found in the interactivity between teachers and students and among students themselves. And I was trying to find this quote, but I think you know who he is. I mean, you've mentioned him a few times in one of your books, Earl Stevick. There's a quote by Earl Stevick says, "Success depends less on materials, techniques, and linguistic analysis, and more on what goes on inside and between the people in the classroom."
This is why I tell people all the time, and in my book, for example, while we're on that topic, I talk about communication in the very first chapter, what it really is. Because most teachers do not have an understanding of what communication is and what it means to be a communicative classroom. And I emphasize the role of context. Context in communication involves 2 main things: the setting and the people, the participants. So the classroom is its own context, right? It's not a bank, it's not a restaurant, it's not. No. So when you practice, let's pretend we're going to the restaurant and order a meal. Let's pretend we're going to the bank, or let's pretend we're in the doctor's office. No, we're not. We're a classroom with real people who have real lives and real things to say and real thoughts and real experiences. That's your context. So what can we talk about in this 4-walled room with these people?
Right.
And how do we talk about that, right? And so you have to understand that context. And it ties right in with what Earl Stevick said, that interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you foment that interaction? And from that concept, I've moved, I tell people you've got to move away from being teacher-centered to teacher-led.
Mm.
So
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's back what I said earlier about the teacher saying, I'm no longer going to teach, I'm going to interact. Well,
Right.
I'm no longer going to be the center of the classroom. I'm going to lead. I may be present. I may be an authority figure, maybe this and I may be that, but I'm not going to be the center. I'm going to lead because they need my help.
Right.
They need my help. They don't need me to teach. They need my help. How do I help? I lead. So I orchestrate. So here's a good example. Those writing groups.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't tell them how to write. I just walked around. Oh no, I don't like that word. It's not strong enough. Keep going. And that's leading, giving them, let them go do it. They know they can figure it out, right? Or when we watch Pan's Labyrinth, I'll give the example I gave about the relationship between the mother and the father. Give me an adjective to describe this relationship. They did. And then we were off and running. I was just leading the discussion. They were offering all kinds of ideas. Like that kid, I mean, did I ask him if he was a mommy's boy? No, he volunteered it. The minute he did that,
And that's the beautiful of it. That's the beauty of it, because you have created opportunities for affordances in the classroom where, and I think the way I see this is that's exactly what the teacher's role is to optimize these language learning affordances through this directing attention to the kind of language that is naturally emerging, right? So language, grammar, vocabulary, they shouldn't be taught explicitly with I would say a lot of teachers have a predefined agenda. They say today we're going to learn the present tense. We're going to learn 10 adjectives to describe, I don't know, global warming, when a lot of that is actually not even relevant for the learners in this case. So I think my question to you is, we're still teaching languages focusing primarily on grammar. So, and you say this a lot in one of your books, what ends up in the learner's mind is not what's on page 32 of the textbook. I think that's a very good example of how we can get grammar out of our heads. But can you tell the listeners here, people who are watching this show, who listen to us, who like our work, what does that mean? Because I think a lot of teachers still don't understand that what's on page 32 is not what ends up here.
Yeah, this might take a little bit of time to explain, so interrupt me so it's not a monologue.
Okay.
when you need to break up my talking. Point number one is that textbook rules, let's just focus on grammar.
Mm-hmm.
Textbook rules are not psychologically real.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not even accurate descriptions. So you've got English teachers out there listening to us, right? Maybe some other teachers too, but let's say this is an example I gave yesterday. You're taught that there are subject pronouns and object pronouns. So in English, the subject pronouns are I, you, he, him, her, we, they, so, or you all, they, and so on. And then the objects are me, you, him, her, and so on and so forth, and them, right? And you go, okay, you get a little chart. In fact, you can Google this. And an ESL learner could Google this him or herself and find, oh yeah, this is English, this is the subject, these are the objects, right? And then I showed people yesterday, for example, what's really in your head. Okay, so you can take a simple example like this. I am going, subject, I works. Me, I'm going, doesn't work, object. And then you do this. John and I are going, John and me are going. How can me be in there if it's an object when John and I are the subject? Now I can say John and me, which is the subject. That's an object. And then you go, and I gave them a bunch of it. Then you can do the opposite, which happens in spoken English all over the place now, is she gave it to John and me. She gave it to John and I. But now watch what happens. She gave it to I and John. No, she gave it to me and John. So I can say she gave it to John and I, but I can't say she gave it to me. So what is in your head? How do subjects and objects actually work? It's not what's on page 32. It's much, much more abstract than that. And here's another example. This is a little more in the weeds, This is for my linguistic nerd friends out there. You're taught that English is a subject-verb language and so on and so forth, or you just know that. You go to study Japanese, and the first thing they teach you is the verb is at the end. So you learn explicitly the verb is at the end. And then you get to case. Okay, the case marker goes after the noun. So if it's nominative, ga, for example, it goes after the noun. If it's object, I think it's o, right? O goes after the noun if it's an object. Okay, so it goes after. And then you learn something. There are things called particles because Japanese doesn't have prepositions. So like instead of saying in the soup, you say soup in, right? So ni is the particle that corresponds to like in, something like in or place. So you got all these things. You get all these different rules. But what really is going on there? And you look, and when you understand that language is built on phrases, noun phrases, verb phrases, prepositional phrases, and so on, then you understand that phrases consist of two parts. They're called heads and complements. So in a verb phrase in English, eats chocolate. Eats is the head of the verb phrase, chocolate is the complement, right? And then you have something like a determiner phrase, and you have the man. The is the head of the determiner phrase, and man is the complement. And then, so sentences are all built on phrases. This is true of every single language in the world. Sign language, spoken language, don't make any difference. Japanese, Urdu, whatever. But unlike English, Japanese has what's called complement head structure. So instead of doing what English does, which is head, the, complement, man, or head, eats, complement, chocolate, Japanese has complement head. So you have, they don't have the, but let's assume they had the Japanese. Man, it would be man, the, right? And it would be chocolate eats. So what you really have in your head in Japanese is not all these 4 or 5 different rules for where you put stuff. It's you have this abstract thing that says, here's how phrases work in Japanese. Heads come after their complements. That's what's in your head. And that's what allows you to have Japanese, something like that. So when I say that what's on page 32 is not what's in your head, I really mean that description is not only not psychologically real, largely, most of the time it's inaccurate. It's just wrong. And so it can't wind up in your head. You never learn the damn language. So, and for follow-up for those people who are asking the question, no, you cannot convert what's on page 32 into what's in your head. It doesn't work that way.
I was about to follow up with that. Yes. Can this, declarative knowledge be converted into procedural knowledge?
No. Let me give you a metaphor. This is one of my favorite. Okay, this is a metaphor. Okay. I'm going to ask Andrew this question. Basic chemistry, right?
Oh God.
What's a water molecule made out of? What's the symbol when you write it?
H. H2O.
H2O, right? H2O. So two atoms of hydrogen and an atom of oxygen. Right? Okay. Now, let's say I got a bunch of those water molecules. I've got about H2Os, and I heat them up. What happens to it? What does it turn into? Psst.
Steam.
Turns in steam, right? Okay. Now, let's say I take those same water molecules, but this time I make them really, really cold. I freeze them. They turn into
ice, I think.
Ice. Okay. Now, have the molecules changed? Are the steam molecules still H2O, or are they something different?
You're really challenging my grade 10. But I think they're different. Or are they the same?
No, H2O is H2O. They haven't changed.
H2O. Okay.
Yeah, they just, what happens with
Even
that
the
is
state is different. Okay.
They're moving around faster, and they're putting more space between the molecules. And then when you freeze them, it's still H2O, but you're condensing the space between the molecules. Okay, great. So you have not changed the nature of the molecules. Now, have you ever seen an olive oil molecule?
No. Definitely not.
It's like on a page, it's like this long. It consists of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And there's like 24 hydrogens in there, and there's a bunch of carbons, a bunch of oxygens, and they're all doing weird. So it's this big, long thing, and it's an intricate, complex molecule. So here's my question, Andrew. Can I heat that H2O molecule and turn it into an olive oil molecule?
50-50 shot.
You can't, right? You can't. Okay. When you heat a water molecule, it turns into steam. It stays a water molecule. Okay. Can I freeze that water molecule and it becomes an olive oil molecule? No, it cannot, right? Because water is water and olive
Right.
oil is olive oil. This is why when you put it together, they don't even mix, they separate, right? They're different things. You can't turn one into the other by any known means or standard means, right? So there's no mechanism by which I can take a water molecule and turn it into an olive oil molecule. I just can't.
Mhm.
And so the same thing is true about language. I can't take that rule on page 32. There's no known mechanism in your brain that can convert it to something that looks like the abstract, complex nature of language, right? So that subject object verb chart that I studied is not going to get me the fact that I can now say, she gave it to John and me, she gave it to John and I, but now she gave it to, I can't say, gave it to I
Interesting.
and John, right? There's no mechanism that converts that. How do I get that? I got it because I process data from the input and my brain is pre-wired to do something with language. That's how I got there, right?
Hmm.
So what I tell people is you're practicing water on page 32, but your learner's head needs to come up with olive oil. It ain't going to get olive
Wow.
oil from the textbook page.
Yeah.
I like that.
It works,
think-
right? You like that? It works, right?
does.
I do
It
like
does.
that. My brain isn't wired for science, but I like the analogy.
I love putting people on the spot. That's my job.
Very. I think I was looking for a way to really help people understand that declarative knowledge does not convert into procedural knowledge. And I just could never think of a very easy example. I remember every time I would talk to other teachers, my explanations were always very convoluted. But I think, Bill, you've just saved my
Well,
life by saying that.
yeah, let me give you one other example real quick. So you've got your I'm going to give you another metaphor, and then I'm going to give you another. Well, let me give you an example of language. Then I'm going to give you another metaphor. So you got the water and olive oil metaphor. Okay, so here's another example just from language. How do you know what's not possible in a language? So how do you know that she gave it to I and John? Just sounds horrible. You don't want to do that, but you don't mind. She gave it to John and I. Why is that one sound so awful? You go, no, not possible. Why is it that you can say he repainted the room and she redecorated the house, but you go, she repetted the dog? She can't repet a dog. No. Or he rebaked the cake. Why can't I say rebake the cake? How do you know those are impossible? How do you know those are impossible?
Leo and I used to call that it sounds right principle.
Exactly. Exactly. So how do you where does that sound right thing come from? Your brain is hardwired to figure this out. It's got constraints it puts on language. It does things to language. And no matter what theory you believe in that does that, the point is it happens in your brain outside of awareness.
Yeah.
I'm not taught what's ungrammatical. I'm only taught what's grammatical, right? In my textbook. But then I have things I can do with language that aren't in the textbook, but I also know what's impossible. Right. And it's not because I haven't heard them, because, I mean, think about this. The classic example of like wanna, you can contract want to wanna. Like, I want to go. Do you want to go? Yeah, I want to go. And I can say, Leo, who do you want to invite to the next podcast? Oh, you go, I want to invite Sylvina. Okay, great. Oh, I know Sylvina, great. Invite her. But Leo, who do you want to conduct the interview? I can't put wanna there. Who do you want to conduct? No, who do you want to? I have to put the tuss down. Who do you want to, or do you want to? But who do you want to? I can't just contract a wanna. Who do you want to conduct? So like, where does that come? How come I can do wanna everywhere else, but I can't do wanna there? And I know I can't. Sounds awful. And nobody ever makes that mistake, either in first or second language acquisition. So our brains come equipped to do stuff. So that's another example of how complex and abstract language is. That's that olive oil part. Okay, so here's your other metaphor. Okay, either one of you have kids?
I do. I have 2 kids.
Okay, you have 2 kids. How about dogs?
No dogs, no.
Okay, works for dogs too. I never had kids, but I had dogs. Okay, so you know what baby teeth are, right? When you had kids, Leo, when they were a little kid, when they were like 1 or 2 years old, they got baby teeth, right?
Yeah.
What happened to those baby teeth?
They don't last very long.
What do? They
fall off, yeah.
They fall out. And then what happens?
New ones.
The
New ones come in, yeah.
adult teeth come in.
Adult teeth, yeah.
Do the baby teeth turn into adult teeth?
Very interesting. Yeah.
They don't, do they?
They don't. No, no.
Okay. So those people who think you learn explicitly and somehow it becomes implicit mental representation language, no. It's like baby teeth and adult teeth. Some people can perform fake communication and fake language at the beginning with this explicit stuff they have.
Yes.
That's baby teeth. So what happens is as your implicit system builds up and builds up and builds up, your brain realizes, heck with that explicit, that's like my baby teeth. I'm going to push that stuff out of the way and let this system take over.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and you only get that system one way. You don't get it from having baby teeth. So that explicit knowledge you get is like baby teeth. It falls to the wayside. It goes nowhere. It's useless in the long run. What you want are adult teeth, and you only get adult teeth one way. There's your other metaphor. How's that? You like that one?
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
that.
I think that's a very compelling argument for, because I remember we had we had someone on the podcast, Andrew. I think it was Jason Anderson, who talked about that, and he basically, and I think he was relying on what's his name, the researcher that talks a lot about that declarative knowledge can be converted into, but he comes from skills acquisition theory.
Oh, back Robert de Keyser?
Yes, the Kaiser. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the issue with in your perception, Bill? What's the problem with de Keyser's theory?
It just can't account for the totality of language acquisition. It can't even account for your ability to speak. So for example, I had a conversation with Robert. I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, through email. And I asked him that very question. Through skill theory, how is it that you come to know that who do you want to conduct the interview you can't do? Or Jane gave it to I and John, you can't do. How does skill theory account for the fact you come to know those things? And he basically said, I don't care about mental representation. And I go, but mental representation is language. That's what language is. It's in your head. It's what it is, right? And so people confuse speaking with language. No, language is in your head. Speaking is part of communication. Okay.
You always say that. Communication is more than just speaking.
Right. And language isn't the same thing as communication. They're two separate things.
Right.
Okay. So there's that issue that skill theory can't account for what's in your head. It can't even account for example, like the wanna. So under skill theory says you learn a rule and you practice it, and it becomes, you go from declarative to procedural, and then you automatize it. There's that final stage of automation. Well, if I'm automatizing wanna, and do you want to go? Yeah, I want to go. Who do you want to invite to the party? Yeah, I want to invite Andrew. So what in skill theory prevents me from saying, who do you want to conduct the next interview? What keeps me from doing that in the skill? Because now that's speaking. That's a speaking part, not the knowledge part. I should be able to, in a skill theory, go, yeah, who do you want to conduct the interview? And guess what? ESL learners don't make that mistake, by the way. Little kids learning English don't, but English ESL speakers don't make that mistake. They don't say stuff like that. If they have contractions, they just don't do it. And I've given tests to ESL learners just to ask them, anecdotally, at different levels of English, and they go, who do you want to, with that weird sentence like that, right? They go, no, that sounds weird. No, is that good English? No, it's not.
No,
yeah,
what you said, yeah.
So skill theory can't account for that, and it never comes out of their mouth. So under skill theory, what keeps you from doing something you should be able to do because you've automatized that phrase or structure, whatever. So to me, there are problems with the theory. That does not mean that in general you get better at doing something overall. You do.
Right. Yeah,
that's absolutely true. The more you listen, the better you get at listening. The more you read, you get better at reading. The more you talk,
the more you write. Yeah.
I mean, but that's communications, not language.
Yeah. And maybe that accounts for what we call what you call pseudo innovation. Then we have pseudo communication, where people feel like they're communicating, but what they're really doing is just regurgitating grammatical phrases, grammatical structures that they've learned from the textbook, and they think they're communicating, but in reality, they're not. Because there's so much more that they have to account for when it comes to language and communication. And I think language teaching specifically, it's this heavy emphasis on speaking. They want their students to speak all the time.
Right. And the skill theory, Robert, if you're listening, I apologize. You can write to me and yell at me if you want. The issue I have with skill theory with some of these other theories too, is they There are theories derived from other contexts
Yes.
that may not apply to language, but people take them and apply them anyway because they think it might. So Anderson, who originally developed skill theory that is the foundational for this, Robert de Keyser and some of his students, what they use, that's an educational theory about learning concepts and learning, and also learning to do things too. But no one stops to ask, is language in your head like everything else?
That's true.
And I'm also, when it comes to, and I'm talking about stuff in your head, because people don't realize we're speaking right now. I'm drawing on what's in my head. It's not because I've practiced language or spoken English. It's because there's language in my head and I can pull on it to communicate, right? But if language is not there in my head, I can't do this. And so it could be true of other domains as well. We don't know if you're really good at math. How did you get really good at math? Is it because of all your explicit learning? Maybe, I don't know. There's so many things in life in general that we have implicitly. Yeah. We have no idea how it got there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
How much or how important, other than listening to this show, you said at the hop, a lot of what happens in classrooms is not informed by theory or research, but there's so much research. How does a teacher decide if they're engaged and they want to learn about this and they want to apply some of this or as much as possible into their classroom? All at once is overwhelming, likely. Do you have a step plan for someone listening that says, hey, I'm interested in this. I want to apply in my classroom, or I want to be informed and move forward, but not all at once. So how would you advise that person who wants to start along this path?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have a good answer. Let me tell you what I've tried to do for teachers, and I'm going to admonish my colleagues in the field, is I know a lot of second language acquisitionists who don't want to talk to teachers. Just because it's not my business. I have nothing to say about teaching. Well, maybe you don't, but that doesn't mean the field doesn't.
Right.
And so you could be in your own little lane or whatever you want to call it of work that you're doing scholarly wise. That is this micro part of this thing we call second language acquisition. But at some point, somebody's got to step back and look at the big picture and say, what are the main things we know, right? And what of that might be useful to teachers? What do they need to know? What are some basics they need to understand? And so one thing I've done over the years, I've always had my foot in that scholarly domain of doing research on second language acquisition, input processing, and so on and so forth and blah, blah. But I've also had my foot in the other door of talking to teachers and trying to write things for teachers. And so we need more of that. We need to distill stuff about that. So like yesterday, the workshop I gave was basically, what are the basic facts? What are some like 5 or 6 basic facts you need to know? Here they are. These are indisputable. I don't care what theory you have. I don't care what these are facts. These are known to be true. Okay, so now what do you do with these facts? How do they inform you? And if you just give them those basic facts, teachers don't need to go read research, but we need more of that kind of publication. That's what I try to do while we're on the topic. The book I just did with Russ Simonson on language acquisition in a nutshell, The Nature of Language. These are all very short books I did with Actful, talking directly to teachers, stripping away the jargon. Sometimes you have to use jargon. You explain as you go, make sure everybody gets it. You try to write in a friendly, conversive tone, not in a scholarly tone. You get rid of citations, all that parenthetical stuff with dates. Get rid of that. Teachers need to see that. You can put at the end, here's the stuff I'm citing from. If you want to read it on your own, here it is. Just make it accessible reading. And so if you do that and it can get circulated, then teachers have something to start with. So I don't fault teachers for not knowing what to do or how to get started. It starts with us scholars who aren't very good at communicating to teachers because we think maybe that's not our job.
And there's always a certain level of institutional support required for that as well, right?
And the thing is, again, I'm not proselytizing a theory. So for example, I don't have to, I work with universal grammar and language processing stuff. I don't have to talk about universal grammar to teachers. If I talk about input is fundamental, and because that's independent of any theory, input is fundamental. And so here are the data. This is what we know about second language acquisition. There's also such a thing called order development, how language unfolds over time in your head. irrespective of UG, irrespective of usage-based things, irrespective of skill theory, irrespective of neurolinguistic stuff. This is just a fact. We've known this for almost 50 years, that language unfolds over time in someone's head in certain ways. That's a fact. So those are the kind of things I'm talking about that are unyoked to a theory that theories need to account for, right? But they're facts independent of any given theory. That's what teachers need to know. And that's what I've been trying to give teachers for the last 25 years.
Yeah. No, I think your work has been seminal in second language acquisition. And for a lot of teachers, I think I was talking to a lot of the people in our audience, and a lot of them don't seem to know who you are. And I was like, no, we have to bring Bill on the show, because like I said, ever since I read that Krashen, I was like, okay, I need to get this guy on the show at some point. And this is kind of what we're trying to do here as well, Bill. Is one of the main reasons why we've been running this podcast for so long is because you were talking about like habit inertia, and how, a lot of teachers, teacher education in general, it's not really informed by how languages are learned and how acquisition happens. And one of the main impetus for us to start this podcast is because we wanted to be this bridge. We wanted to bring the scholars onto the show and talk to them. It's like, talk to us. We have lots of questions. We are still classes from teachers. I like doing my own research. I like doing my own thing. I didn't want to follow a path in academia, because I wanted to kind of have my feet in both feet in the playground, like in different playgrounds. But I wanted to wrap this up because we've been talking for God knows how long. And I know you have your cocktail hours coming up soon.
Yeah, it's only 12:30 now, and I'm cocktail for a while.
Oh, no cocktail.
Not till 4 o'clock.
Not till 4. Okay.
I gotta go work out. I gotta work out first, then I get cleaned up, and then I'll
nice.
do cocktails later.
And I have like a few very, like maybe 1 or 2 more questions that we wanted to ask. And then Andrew has a little caveat for us that we have on the show. But the 2 questions that I have for you, the first one is, you might not have an answer for this, but if you feel compelled to share this with us, is what's a belief or the belief that you hold that most people disagree with you on?
That most people?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would say most people. I would say a lot of people.
Okay.
That explicit learning does very little for language acquisition, if anything. I mean, Krashen would agree with me. Michael Sharwood Smith would agree with me. John Truscott would agree with me. What happens is that one thing here's a fact about language acquisition, just a fact. Most people are non-native like in some way or another in a second language. No matter how good they sound, I can give them very subtle tests and they're non-native in this little area that you're aware of. But some people have accents, there's a big range of non-nativeness people can fall on, and different domains in which they can be non-native. So there's a fact of non-nativeness. So what happens when some people disagree with me is when I say explicit learning is not going to do it. Well, we need it because input alone doesn't do the job. What do you mean input alone doesn't do the job? Well, people might be missing this, or they might be non-native like that. And you think instruction is going to take care of that? Maybe that's just the way it is. And then I remind them of the following. You haven't done much work in first language acquisition and use, have you? Because we have research on adult speakers of English that show that there is a range of abilities. Remember the passive tense I told you about earlier? The cow was kicked by the horse. There's some just classic research that shows that college-educated adults process those sentences faster and more accurately than people who don't have college education. And these are native speakers of English. So this group that's not college educated, clearly they've got passives in their head, but they're more prone to making mistakes in the cow was kicked by the horse, thinking the cow did the kicking, for example, than their college educated parts. Now, why is that? Was there something happen in college that they learned the passive? No. Look at what these people are exposed to. Mm-hmm. They got greater input, richer input, written text stuff, because you got to read when you're a college student, and passives are much more prevalent in written language than they are in oral language, right? So there's an example of how you can find differences in even in native speakers, how long it takes for them to get something. And there wouldn't be dialect differences within like American English if the fact that people didn't fall in a range of things, right? So you try to remind people that there's this idea of nativeness, that somehow we can get them over a hump or get them past something by teaching it to them because input's not enough. You go, that's not logical. That makes no sense. But that's one of the arguments I hear. So when I say, I'm sorry, explicit teaching and learning doesn't really do much in the long run. In the short run, the beginning, you got your baby teeth, yeah. But in the long run, it doesn't do much.
Right.
And I get pushback from that from a lot of people, actually. They just don't want to hear that. And in some theories, there's some, I call it, you want to have your cake and eat it too. There's one theory I won't mention that puts a fundamental central role of input and implicit learning. It's absolutely crucial and significant to the theory.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go, but we know that people are sometimes not native, they miss this and that. So therefore, some explicit teaching and learning will probably be good. Anyway.
I think you've answered a lot of my own internal questions that I have been exploring with my own therapist about. I learned English as a second language, and I would say 95% of my learning came from exposure alone, reading a lot and just watching a lot of TV in English. And I know people who have learned English to almost like a proficient level. And I asked them, like, how did you learn to speak like that? And they're like, I watched a lot of Friends and I played video games. So they were communicating the whole time. They were exposed to language the whole time. So I think a lot of what you're saying here, I'm actually certain that a lot of what you're saying is actually perhaps a very good and a very accurate reflection of how people actually learn languages, which leads me to the second question, which might be a little more difficult than the first one. When you are, near the end of your life, and we know you still have another 67 years ahead of you, and you're looking back over it, what will you be proudest of, and what will you regret the most?
It's the same thing. I will be proud of it, and I'm regretting it at the same time. I'm proud that I did not lock myself in an ivory tower, and I spent a large part of my career talking to teachers and trying to put stuff in teachers' hands. And I regret that I couldn't get more people to do it, and I regret that I didn't have more of an impact than having some impact, I think I do, but I regret that I couldn't do more. I regret that it's like a trickle in a bucket, or an ocean. And so it's that. Really, I'm really proud that I was able to wear two hats. And I really admire teachers. And I feel they get left out in the wilderness sometimes. That's a terrible metaphor, but I'll say it. And so I've always wanted to talk to them in some way or another. But I don't know if I was good enough. I don't know if I got it all done.
I think this podcast is another way for us to spread your message, maybe for people in different parts of the world to actually listen to you, know who Bill VanPatten is, become more familiar with your work. And I'm going to send you a message later, but I have an interesting offer based on your response here, which is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think you're going to say yes to that, but that's a different conversation. Andrew, less thing. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Now I'm going to say one thing. I won't mention his name, but I can think of someone who's really, really well known at ELT, right, around the world. And in my mind, one of the most shameful scholars. Shameful because I think he overstates the case so much. And he's like a god to ELT teachers. And I'm really well known in the United States, and Canada actually, and parts of Latin America. I've lectured all over Latin America. In second language research, I'm well known. If you read second language research, I'm cited by people all over the world and stuff. So that I'm not worried about. But with teachers, particularly in ELT, I'm not as well known because there are certain people who over the years have usurped that market in terms of being a voice for ELT teachers. And quite frankly, sometimes I think these people talk out of both sides of their mouths. They're not consistent. That's all I'm going to say. Done. I won't name names.
Spoiler, or
Okay.
just a little teaser there. I like.
I think I have an idea who that person might be, but that's going to be off the record.
If you say a name, I'm going to deny it, Leo. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course.
This really is like a Barbara Walters interview. I get to gossip and everything. Okay.
Let people guess, and if they don't know if they're right or not, it's even better. That's perfect. I like it. We do a little thing we're starting a new thing in the last couple of shows at the end, where it's two parts, and this is where I get to return the favor and put you on the spot. We ask a question to each guest that they don't know
No,
who the
no,
next.
no. The answer is no. Go ahead. I'm
It's not a
sorry.
yes or no question. Where they don't know who the next guest is that we're interviewing, but they get to ask that guest a question. And the question that was left for you from our previous interview was about AI and how you feel about it within language education. And you can take that any way you want, or as a tool for either teaching or acquiring languages, or you mentioned teachers need to move to be interlocutors and these kinds of things. So I'll leave it as a big general question. You can take it in any direction you want. How do you feel about AI in teaching and learning in terms of languages?
I think AI is fine for lots of good reasons. Let me tell you why. AI can help teachers create good little reading texts that they could. I'm a big believer in flash fiction for students. Real short stories that are like 400 words long, 500 words long that you can use and stuff. AI can help you generate those if you're not a good writer or whatever. They can help you do that. And those are great places to find themes and things to use in your classroom as part of this interaction. So you have the written input, but then you have the interaction with that input that you and the learners are doing and so on. That's good. And I haven't explored AI that much. I've just heard about it. I've heard a lot of complaints about it. And the complaints I've heard is, oh, students are now turning in work that's not theirs. I can tell it's AI generated. And my response to the teacher is, it's not the student's problem, it's your problem because of the kind of assignment you gave them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so good.
Look, for example, I was just talking about my conversation class before. Not a single one of those students wrote outside of class. I made it a writing workshop in class, and I made it collaborative between 4 students. There's no room for AI there. Yeah. And because I was walking around seeing, I know exactly what they were doing, and they could try to go to AI now, and they wouldn't fool me because they know I'm seeing in the class what they're doing. It's because of what teachers ask of students that forces students to do things that they wouldn't normally do as part of acquisition learning. Very true. Stop giving those kinds of tasks and assignments and do the kinds of things that you can't use it for. AI is eminently suited to help people get through traditional learning, traditional instruction, but it's not particularly good at helping people get through communication in a classroom.
Or who's a mama's boy?
Or who's your mama's boy? Yeah. I mean, nobody's going to help you bring that up in class, right? Or even like, for example, the homework that I told you about, I could give a survey. Okay, I want you to write 5 questions right now before you leave class. Let me see your questions because you're going to go interview people. Mm-hmm. And AI can't help you do that. They still have homework to, they're going to go do that. And then they're not going to use AI to convert what they've gotten in English from these people to Spanish. They're going to use, I know that's not going to happen. They might use Google to look up a few words in their translate. I don't care about that. That's fine. Because I know they're learning something when they do that. Yeah. But yeah, so I think everybody looks at AI as a big boogie person when it's really, that's not the boogie person. The boogie person is what we make learners do.
Yeah.
Wow. And a lot of people cheat on tests because they feel afraid of failing the test, right?
Yeah, because there's a grade involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that external pressure to produce something that I don't feel like they can produce.
Yep.
And they don't really care about producing it.
Yep. If you always push people to do something they can't do, they'll find a way to try to do it.
Yeah.
Well said. All right. Part 2, before we wrap up, is now your turn. You can leave it. You don't know who the next guest is, but you can leave a question that we will ask that person.
Oh, let's see. What do I want to ask that person? I'm going to ask that person.
Don't use AI to create your question.
No. I think what I want to ask is, if you were to talk to a group of teachers, because they're interested in being informed by second language research, what would you tell them about competing theories? And so they've heard that theories are in conflict. So what would you tell teachers to think about that? Or what would you tell teachers that means for them, if anything at all?
Love it. Great question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
You're welcome. This was fun. Are we going to do it again sometime?
Absolutely. You bet.